Hello guys, now we will present to you about geologic and engineering aspect of naturally fractured reservoirs. Before we start, we will introduce our team. My name is Khalida Priani and then...
My name is Muhammad Ubir Manda.
My name is Dari.
And my name is Haris Aka. Now, let's start. Stay tuned in our video and check this out.
All naturally fractured reservoirs are not created equal. It is of paramount importance to have knowledge of geologic aspect for reservoir, where the fracture have a positive or negative effect on fluid flow. Classifying the reservoir from a geologic point of view, keeping in mind that the fracture can be tectonic, regional or contractional, evaluating the pore system, quantifying the relative hydrocarbon storativity of matrix and fracture, and getting a good idea with respect to the matrix or fracture interaction. These data help in calculation of how the in-place hydrocarbon are distributed between matrix and fracture and the flow capacity of the well. Geologic specification. From a geologic point of view, the fracture can be classified as being tectonic, fault and or fault related, regional, contractional or geodetic, and surface related. Historically, most hydrocarbon production has been obtained from tectonic fractures, followed by regional fractures and followed by contractional fracture. In general, surface related fractures are not important from the point of view of hydrocarbon production. When classifying fracture, determine magnitude and direction of in situ principal stresses, azimuth, depth, spacing, and if possible, aperture of fractures. Porosity classification. In this classification, porosity classes are divided first by geometry of the pores, and the second is pore size. Included in geometry of the following general pore categories: intergranular, intercrystalline, fuggy, and fractal. Combination of any of them can give origin to dual, even multiporosity behavior. The pore size can be recognized from different techniques, including Whelan and Aguilera pore throat aperture. Included in the give pore size are megaporosity, radius above 10 microns, macroporosity, radius between 2 and 10 microns, mesoporosity, radius between 0.5 and 2 microns, and the last is microporosity, radius below 0.5 microns. Martin and al. Have indicated that megapores are capable of flowing tens of thousands barrels per day, macroport thousands of barrels per day, mesoport hundreds of barrels per day, and microport tens of barrels per day. Figure 1 shows a graph for estimating values of radius velocity for the matrix in naturally fractured reservoir. The graph followed the same format presented by Martin et al. Using Whelan equations. Storage classification. From a storage point of view, fractured reservoir can be classified as being type A, type B, or C. In reservoir of type A, the bulk of the radiocarbon stored is in the matrix porosity and a small amount of storage in the fracture. In a reservoir of type B, approximately half the hydrocarbon stored is in the matrix and half is in the fracture. And in reservoir of type C, all hydrocarbon stored is in the fractures with no contribution from the matrix. Matrix or fracture interaction. Cores provide an excellent source of direct information for determining the kind of interaction that could be anticipated from fractures and matrix. Consider different possibilities. First, no secondary mineralization. When the natural fracture even open and have negligible amount of secondary mineralization, the hydrocarbon move from the matrix to the fracture in an unrestricted way. Some secondary mineralization. When natural fracture have a certain amount of secondary mineralization, the fluid flow from the matrix to fracture is somewhat restricted. Complete secondary mineralization, even if there is a lot of hydrocarbon within the reservoir, the ultimate recovery will be low. The minerals fractures will compartmentalize the reservoir, leading to very low ultimate recoveries. And the last is fuggy fractures. They can have very large porosity, they can reach 100% in some interval and several darcies of permeabilities. Production can be several thousand of barrels per day if the faults are connected, all touching the faults. That's all. Thank you very much.
Everything changes.
And next, we talk about engineer aspect. For engineer perspective, it deals with quantitative evolution naturally fractured reservoirs. The qualification links are the geophysics, geologic, and geochemist and other engineer disciplines. Characterization of the naturally fractured reservoir and engineer evolution rely on direct and indirect source of information. Direct source of information include cores, drill string, downhole photograph, and videos of the borehole. Indirect source include outcrops, drilling history, mud lodging, and specialist well logs information. And now, in direct source information, the successful study of a naturally fractured reservoir core must start at well site. Distribution of the fracture core must be minimized by using double tube core barrels, which have successfully replaced rubber sleeve coring method. The core should be preserved as best as possible, preferentially by wrapping it in plastic and placing it in Ziploc bags. Next is drilling cuttings. Many times, natural fracture may not be preserved in cuttings due to breakage along cuttings. Consequently, the reservoir may be naturally fractured even if the cuttings do not show any fractures. However, there are exceptions. Hughes 17 has indicated that there are instances where cuttings can provide very useful information with respect to fracture. Under this circumstance, it is advisable to examine the cuttings thinking in terms of natural fracture. Crystals on the face of a fracture can be indicative of very effective fracture porosity. Thin section from cuttings can also provide evidence of natural fractures. Cemented microfracture in thin section can be extensions of large open fracture. And next is downhole borehole cameras. Photos and video tapes can provide direct information regarding many fractures penetrated by the borehole, including natural fractures, faulting, bed boundaries, hole size, and hole shape. There are video cameras that have been developed to examine vertical, slanted, and horizontal wells. Ideally, low-pressure reservoirs are prime candidates for application of video camera technology.
Everything changes.
And next we talk about indirect source of information. In indirect source of information include outcrops, drilling history, mud log, well log, seismic information, pressure data, and production history. And first is outcrops. They are essential to school of thought when it comes to the elevation of outcrops. The first one indicated that using outcrop data to characterize the fracture pattern of reservoir is first stated by the stress release with occur as rock come to the surface, and that outcrop data is unsuitable for modeling reservoir fractures. And the second school of thought indicated that outcrop, when properly elevated, can provide a significant amount of valuable information in exploration place and during the development of a reservoir. And the second is drilling history. It contributes valuable information regarding hydrocarbons shows mud losses and penetration rate. Mud losses might be associated with natural fracture faults, underground caverns, or induced fractures. Penetration rate can increase significantly while drilling all types of secondary porosity. And the third is well logs. Logs are powerful indicator of natural fractures in some reservoirs. However, there is not a single log that is going to work all the time. Logs in the past mostly form a qualitative point of view to determine where the fractures are located. Sonic amplitude, variable intensity, vertical seismic profiling, caliper, resistivity, PE, borehole televiewer, deep matter, spontaneous potential, density correction curve, borehole gravimeter, uranium index, temperature, and noise logs. Details on this technique are available in the literature of the various. And the fourth is seismic information. Significant advances have been achieved in 3D seismic technology that allow, in some cases, determination of fracture orientation, anisotropy, and fracture density, and the type of fluid that could be present in the reservoir. Under favorable condition, this is be estimated using AVO, or amplitude versus offset, and AVAZ. And the fifth is well testing. This is an area that has also seen significant advance in the precision of the tool and the interpretation software package. Modern formation tester can provide vertical information that cannot be detected by a standard test. Multiple probes can show the presence or lack of vertical interference in a wellbore. Automatic type curve matching is powerful but dangerous. To avoid fiascos with automatic matching, it is important to make sure that the engineering is always on top of the interpretation. Numerical 2D well testing models using unstructured photonoid grids, or PEBI, provide a significant and necessary extension to the more conventional Cartesian, semi-logarithmic, and log-log derivative cross-plot. A properly designed and supervised test can provide valuable information include fracture permeability, fracture porosity, and the fracture spacing, in addition to usually estimate parameters such as gain, radius of investigation, explorated pressure, etc. And the last is production history. If from course the permeability of the information is 0.1 md and the well process 100 POPD, it can be inferred that the rate is the result of some types of secondary porosity, include the fractures.
Everything changes.
Okay, next we talk about recovery fracture and reserve. The optimum way of forecasting performance and recovery is utilizing a reservoir simulator as long as the reservoir characterization and the quality of the pressure and production data is good. Based on experience, it is reasonable to forecast twice the time of available history. For example, if there are 2 years of good production and pressure data, it is reasonable to forecast 4 years production. First, compressibility. If the reservoir is compressed by matrix and fracture, the compressibility of the fracture is bigger than the compressibility of the matrix. The relative difference between the two compressibilities depends on various fracture, including the amount of secondary mineralization within the fracture, the orientation of the fracture and in situ stress, and if the reservoir is over pressure, normally pressure, or under pressure. In a dual porosity system made up of macro and micro fracture, the macro fracture play the role of fracture and the micro fracture play the role of matrix. In the case, there are instances in which the micro fracture can be more compressibility than the macro fracture. In other instances, both compressibility can be of the same order of magnitude. Second, range of recovery. Each naturally fractured reservoir should be considered as a research project by itself. As such, it has to be studied carefully to estimate recovery. It is wise to remember that natural fractured reservoir and rules of thumb do not mix well. What appears to work in one reservoir might fall miserably in the next. That range of recovery will be shown in two tables based on engineers' experience working with natural fractured reservoir worldwide with about 30 years. Thus, oil and gas recovery estimates are present for different recovery mechanisms and different type of fracture reservoir. And the last, reserve. Most natural fracture reservoirs I'm familiar with are characterized by low matrix porosity. It's less than 10% and low matrix permeability less than 1 MD. For this reservoir characteristic, it is difficult to place a reasonable certainty of volumetric estimates of original hydrocarbon in place and reserve. As a consequence, they recommend placing reserve from volumetric estimate in the possible category for matrix porosity less than 10% and matrix permeability less than 1 MD. The reserve can be moved to the probable category.
First, there will extraordinary advance in the geophysical, geological, and engineering fields. These advances have led to improved estimates of recoveries and reserves. These improvements will continue. And second, over the next few years, there will be significant improvement in seismic technology to better characterize anisotropy of naturally fractured reservoirs.
And next, there will be advances in the evaluation of well cores and the uncertainty associated with estimate of fracture compressibility will be reduced. And imaging logs will continue improving, and this will lead to more reasonable estimate of fracture parameters.
More, better, and more realistic well testing and reservoir stimulation model will be developed. Hydrocarbon recoveries will continue increasing as more deviated and horizontal wells are drilled under balance to properly intersect, or if desired, avoid vertical and high inclination natural fractures.
And finally, this is all our presentation. May this topic will give us more information. Thank you for our best dosen, Mr. Edi Untoro, that give us this project, and also thank you to you all guys, to watch our video until the end. And see you in our next video.
Everything changes.
Ini kalau syuting action. Our natural fracture is about normal trade.
Normal pressure.
under pressure. In a dual porosity system made out of macro and micro fracture, the macro fracture play the role of fracture, and the micro fracture play the role.
My name is Haris Mantri. Okay, now we start and
Kalau jangan aja, bisa di sini apa yang mau aku ngomongin nih?
Anjing.
we start stay tuned and check it out.
Dilepaskan lagi. Action.
Hello guys, now we will present about geologic and engineering aspect of natural